Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet space we're creating together. You've chosen to spend these moments before sleep with an old tale, one you may remember from childhood, but tonight we'll explore it differently, with the understanding and perspective that only adult experience can bring. This is a story for the grown-up you, told in a way that honors both the magic of fairy tales and the wisdom you've gathered through your years. Settle yourself comfortably now, in whatever position feels most restful. You don't need to do anything special or be anywhere other than exactly where you are. Let your body find its natural resting position, adjusting as needed, sinking a little deeper into the surface that supports you. The day is done, its demands completed or set aside, and these next hours belong entirely to rest. Fairy tales have always been more than children's entertainment. These old stories, passed down through generations, carry within them psychological truths and emotional wisdom that speak to us at every age. Tonight's tale, Beauty and the Beast, is one of the richest, exploring themes of appearance and reality, fear and love, transformation and acceptance. But you don't need to analyze these themes or think too deeply about meanings. Simply let the story wash over you. Let it carry you gently toward sleep. The rhythm of storytelling, the rise and fall of narrative, has been lulling humans to sleep since our ancestors first gathered around fires and shared tales in the darkness. There's something deeply soothing about being told a story, about letting someone else's voice guide your imagination, about following a path that's already been laid out. You don't need to create or decide or figure out. You simply need to listen or to let the words flow past you as you drift toward sleep. In the tradition of bedtime stories, this telling will be gentle and unhurried. We have all the time we need. There's no rush to reach the ending, no urgency in the unfolding. The story will carry you along at its own pace, meandering through details, pausing in quiet moments, allowing you to sink deeper into relaxation as the tale progresses. If you fall asleep before the end, that's perfect. If you stay with the story all the way through, that's equally perfect. The story exists to serve your rest, not the other way around. Close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become a screen upon which this tale can unfold. You might see the scenes I describe, or you might simply hear the words without images, or you might drift in and out of attention as sleep begins to claim you. All of these are exactly right. There's no wrong way to experience a bedtime story. Take a slow, easy breath, letting it flow in naturally, and then release gently. And another, a little deeper perhaps, your body knowing instinctively how to breathe for rest. And one more, feeling your shoulders drop a little, your jaw soften, your whole body beginning to recognize that this is time for sleep, for dreams, for the rest that restores us. Now, let us begin our tale. Once upon a time, and all the best stories begin this way, because once upon a time is really code for in a place outside of regular time, in a realm where magic is real and transformations are possible, in a space where the rules that govern ordinary life don't quite apply. Once upon a time, there lived a wealthy merchant who had 3 daughters. But before we meet them properly, let's set the scene. Imagine an era long past when travel meant horses and carriages, when communication meant letters delivered by hand, when the world was both larger and smaller than our own. Larger because distances took so much longer to cross. Smaller because communities were tighter, everyone knowing everyone else's business. A time when forests were deep and genuinely wild, when a person could become truly lost, when the boundary between the mundane world and the world of magic seemed thinner, more permeable. In this time and place, in a prosperous city near the coast, our merchant lived in a grand house with his 3 daughters. Picture the house if you will, though you don't need to work hard at picturing. Let impressions arise naturally. Perhaps you see stone walls, tall windows, rooms furnished with heavy wooden furniture, tapestries on walls, candles providing gentle light in the evenings. Or perhaps you simply have a feeling of comfort, of wealth, of a life well cushioned against hardship. The merchant had once been married, but his wife had died when the girls were young, and he had raised them himself with the help of servants and governesses. He was a good man, kind but perhaps too indulgent, especially with his 2 eldest daughters. He loved them all and wanted them to be happy, to have everything they desired. In this, he may have done them a disservice, but that's knowledge that comes only later in our tale. The 2 older daughters, we might as well call them what they were vain and proud. They spent their days in expensive pursuits, buying gowns and jewels, attending parties and balls, flirting with suitors, and competing with other wealthy young women for attention and status. They were not wicked, not cruel exactly, but they were shallow, concerned only with appearance and pleasure, with how things looked rather than how things were. But the youngest daughter was different, and it's her story we're really here to tell. Let your breathing deepen now. Let your body relax a little more as we meet our heroine. The youngest daughter was called Belle, though some versions of this story call her Beauty because of how lovely she was. But her beauty was not simply of face and form, though she was certainly fair to look upon. Her beauty was deeper, a quality of character that showed in her kind eyes, her gentle smile, her thoughtful manner. While her sisters primped and preened before mirrors, Belle could most often be found in her father's library, lost in a book, traveling to far-off lands through words and imagination. She was quiet, where her sisters were loud, modest, where they were showy, content, where they were always wanting more. This is not to say she was perfect. No one in a good story is perfect. She perhaps had a touch of pride herself, the pride of thinking herself above her sister's concerns, of knowing she was different and taking some satisfaction in that difference. But she was fundamentally good-hearted, and she loved her father dearly. The merchant loved all his daughters, but he had a special soft spot for Belle, though he tried not to show it too obviously. She reminded him of his late wife, not just in appearance, but in temperament, the same quietness,
the same depth, the same ability to find joy in simple things. When he returned from his trading voyages, his two elder daughters would immediately demand what gifts he'd brought them, what jewels and fabrics and luxuries. But Belle would simply embrace him and say she was happy he was home safely, that his presence was gift enough. Though, if pressed, she might request a book, something rare or unusual, stories from distant lands, poetry, philosophy. Her father would smile and promise to find something special for her, and she would thank him genuinely, already imagining the hours of pleasure the book would bring her. Life was good for this family, comfortable and secure. The merchant's trading ventures prospered. The ships he invested in came safely to port, laden with exotic goods that sold for excellent prices. His wealth grew, and with it his daughters' wardrobes and jewel boxes, and the grand house they lived in. The elder daughters were courted by suitable young men from good families. Everything seemed settled and prosperous, and destined to continue just so. But as anyone who has lived long enough knows, fortune is changeable. The winds that fill your sails one day may blow against you the next. This is one of life's great lessons, isn't it? That security is always more fragile than we think, that circumstances can shift in ways we don't anticipate. You've learned this yourself, haven't you, through your own years of experience? Let that understanding inform how you hear this next part of our tale.
One year, disaster struck. It came not all at once, but in a cascade of misfortunes. First, one of the merchant's ships was lost in a storm at sea, taking with it a fortune in goods and, more importantly, the lives of men who had sailed on her. Then news came that another ship had been taken by pirates in the Mediterranean, its cargo seized. Then a warehouse fire destroyed a stockpile of precious silks and spices that had been waiting for buyers. Each piece of bad news struck like a blow, and the merchant reeled under the accumulated weight of them. His wealth, which had seemed so solid, so permanent, evaporated with frightening speed. There were debts to pay, loans that had seemed trivial when he was prosperous, but now loomed ominously. He sold what he could: the grand house, the fancy furniture, the artwork and luxuries. His daughters' suitors, seeing the change in the family's fortunes, quietly withdrew their attentions and found other prospects. The two older sisters wailed and complained. How could this happen to them? What would people think? How could they show their faces in society now that they had nothing? Their father tried to comfort them, but their grief was only for lost status and pretty things, not for his pain or worry. Belle, though, received the news quietly. She felt sorrow for her father's distress, concern about our future, but she didn't waste time lamenting what was lost. "We'll manage," she told him. "We still have each other. We'll find a way."
And they did find a way, though it meant a dramatic change in their circumstances. The merchant had a small cottage in the countryside, a property he'd almost forgotten about, left to him by a distant relative. It was humble, far from the city and society, but it was shelter, and it was paid for. And so the family moved there, leaving behind their life of luxury for one of rural simplicity. Let yourself imagine this transition, the way circumstances can require us to adapt, to let go of one way of living and embrace another. Perhaps you've experienced something similar in your own life, not necessarily a change in wealth, but some shift that required you to become different, more flexible, more resourceful. These changes, difficult as they are, often teach us more than times of ease. The cottage was small but sound, with a few rooms and a garden. The countryside around it was beautiful in its way, rolling hills, forests, streams, the sounds of nature rather than city bustle. But beauty doesn't fill your stomach or keep you warm. And the family quickly learned that rural life required work they'd never had to do before. Without servants to do everything, they had to learn to cook and clean, to tend the garden, to maintain the cottage. The two older sisters were hopeless at such tasks, complaining constantly about their ruined hands, their aching backs, the unfairness of having to do such menial labor. They spent most of their time moping and reminiscing about their former life, about the parties they were missing, the gowns they no longer had. But Belle adapted. She arose early and learned to bake bread, to tend the vegetables in the garden, to keep the cottage clean and comfortable. It was hard work, much harder than anything she had done in her former life, and her hands did grow rough, and there were days when she fell into bed exhausted. But there was also something satisfying about it, about creating comfort with her own hands, about knowing that the food on the table and the clean rooms and the flowers in the window were results of her own effort. She even found moments of happiness, early morning walks before the day's work began, the smell of fresh bread baking, the simple pleasure of a well-made meal shared with her father, the quiet evenings when she could still read by candlelight, savoring the few books they'd been able to bring with them. Her father watched her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride at her resilience and good nature, sorrow that she had to work so hard, that he couldn't provide better for her. She deserved more, he thought. She deserved everything her sisters demanded and taken for granted. She deserved luxury and ease, someone to care for her rather than her having to care for everyone else. But Belle, when she saw this sadness in his eyes, would smile and tell him she was content. "We have enough," she'd say. "We have each other and our health and a roof over our heads. Many people have less." And while part of her did miss the books and beauty of her former life, she meant what she said. She had learned one of life's essential truths, that happiness comes not from circumstances, but how we meet those circumstances, from the attitude we bring to our days. The family lived this way for a time. How long doesn't matter in our story, whether it was months or years. Time in fairy tales is fluid, compressed or extended as needed. What matters is that they adjusted, adapted, found a new rhythm of living. The merchant aged in this time, his hair growing whiter, his movements slower. The two older sisters grew bitter, their beauty fading with their perpetual unhappiness. But Belle remained steady, a point of light in the small cottage, making the best of things, finding small joys, taking care of everyone. And then, one day, everything changed again. Let your breathing deepen now. Let your body sink a little more heavily into rest as we reach the part of the story where the magical enters the mundane, where the extraordinary interrupts the ordinary.
Word came to the merchant that one of his ships, the one he'd thought lost to pirates, had actually made it safely to port after all. The news had been wrong, or perhaps the ship had escaped after being captured. The details don't matter. What mattered was that there was cargo to be claimed, goods that could be sold, money that could dramatically improve the family's circumstances. Not back to their former wealth, perhaps, but enough to make life easier, to lift some of the burden from Belle's shoulders. The merchant, though he was not young and the journey was long, decided he must go to the city himself to handle the business. His daughters, hearing the news, immediately began making requests. The two older sisters wanted everything: new gowns, jewels, perfumes, all the luxuries they'd been deprived of. They gave him long lists and detailed descriptions of exactly what they wanted, as if the lost wealth had already been restored. When the merchant turned to Belle and asked what she wanted him to bring her, she simply smiled. "I don't need anything, Father. Your safe return is all I wish for." But he pressed her. "There must be something. Your sisters have asked for so much. Surely there's something you'd like." Belle thought for a moment, not wanting to disappoint him by asking for nothing at all. Finally, she said, "If you happen to see one, would you bring me a rose? We have none growing here, and I do miss them." The merchant promised he would and prepared for his journey. Belle packed him food for the road, mended his traveling cloak, and kissed him goodbye at the cottage door, watching until he disappeared down the road toward the distant city. The journey to the city was long, and you can let the details of it drift past you, unimportant, like dreams you can't quite remember. The merchant traveled by horse along dusty roads, through villages and fields, crossing rivers and climbing hills. Let your mind's eye, if it's forming images at all, see these scenes in a soft, vague way, like memories or impressions, rather than crisp pictures. Or simply hear the words and let them wash over you
without trying to visualize anything at all. He reached the city and found his ship and his cargo, only to discover that things were more complicated than the message had suggested. There were legal disputes to settle, fees and taxes to pay, complications with customs and merchants. The money he'd hoped to claim was tied up in red tape and negotiations. Days stretched into weeks as he tried to sort everything out, staying in a cheap inn, spending what little money he had on fees and bribes. Finally, he extracted what he could, far less than he'd hoped, and began the journey home. It was late in the year now, and he'd been gone longer than planned. He worried about his daughters, especially Belle, who would have been managing everything alone, as her sisters were useless for practical matters. He wanted to get home quickly, and perhaps he pushed harder than he should have, traveling later into the evenings, starting earlier in the mornings. He was still several days from home when the weather changed. Winter was approaching, and the sky grew dark and heavy. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, see it in the clouds massing on the horizon. He should have stopped, should have sought shelter in the last village he'd passed through, but he was so anxious to get home that he pressed on, thinking he might outrun the storm or at least get closer to home before it hit. He was wrong. The storm caught him in a desolate stretch of country, far from any town or village. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the rain began. Not a gentle rain, but a driving, soaking deluge that quickly had him drenched despite his cloak. Thunder cracked and boomed, lightning split the sky, and his horse began to panic, dancing sideways, pulling at the reins. The merchant could barely see through the rain. The road, as it was, became muddy and treacherous. He knew he needed to find shelter, but where? There was nothing around, just forest on all sides, the trees creaking and groaning in the wind. He tried to remember if there was any house or inn ahead, but his memory was confused by cold and fear and the disorienting darkness of the storm. His horse, finally spooked beyond control by a particularly loud thunderclap, reared and bolted, crashing through the underbrush off the road. The merchant held on desperately, branches whipping at his face, the horse racing in blind panic through the trees. They might have gone on like that until the horse collapsed or threw him, but suddenly they burst out of the forest into a clearing, and the horse, as if sensing safety, slowed and then stopped, sides heaving, head hanging low. The merchant slid from the saddle, his legs weak, his whole body shaking from cold and shock. The rain was still pouring down, and he looked around desperately for any shelter. And there, through the sheets of rain, he saw something that made him wonder if he was hallucinating. Lights in the distance, the outline of what appeared to be a castle, a palace, something grand and impossible in this wild, remote place. But he was too cold and desperate to question it. He led his exhausted horse toward the lights, toward what promised to be shelter from the terrible storm. The path became clearer as he approached, a paved drive, gates that stood open, walls and towers emerging from the rain-dimmed darkness. The whole place had an otherworldly quality, as if it existed slightly outside normal reality, as if he'd somehow stumbled through a door into somewhere else entirely. But again, he was too focused on immediate survival to think about such things. He passed through the gates into a courtyard, and wonder of wonders, there was a stable door standing open, warm light and the smell of hay coming from within. He led his horse inside, found an empty stall, and removed the saddle and bridle with numb fingers. There was hay in the manger, water in the bucket, everything a horse needed, as if someone had prepared for their arrival. Once his horse was settled, the merchant turned his attention to his own needs. He was soaked through, shivering violently, and he knew he needed to get dry and warm before he caught his death. He left the stable and approached the palace itself, looking for an entrance. The great front doors stood slightly ajar, light and warmth spilling out. He hesitated, should he knock, call out? But the rain was still pouring and he was so cold, so he pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. Let yourself feel the transition from cold and wet to warmth and dryness, from chaos and fear to shelter and safety. It's like coming home after a difficult day, or getting into bed after being cold, or finding unexpected comfort when you'd expected hardship. Your body might relax a little more now, recognizing this feeling of finding shelter, of being safe from the storm.
The interior of the palace was magnificent. Candles burned in crystal chandeliers, casting warm light on marble floors, on walls hung with tapestries and paintings, on furniture that looked both elegant and comfortable. A fire roared in a massive fireplace, its warmth drawing the merchant like a magnet. But most strange of all, there was no one there. No servants, no host, no sound of human presence anywhere. "Hello," the merchant called, his voice echoing in the empty grandeur. "Is anyone here? I apologize for entering without permission, but the storm, I needed shelter." No answer came, just the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of rain against windows. The merchant stood dripping on the marble floor, uncertain what to do. Should he leave? But where would he go in the storm? Should he stay? But whose hospitality was he accepting? Before he could decide, he noticed something that made the decision for him. On a table near the fire sat a tray with food and wine, steam still rising from covered dishes. It looked fresh, as if someone had just placed it there, but there was no one in sight. The merchant's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since morning, and the smell of the food was intoxicating. "Hello," he called, again louder this time. "I don't mean to intrude, but might I have some of this food? I'll pay for it, I promise. I have a little money." Still no answer, but somehow the silence felt permissive, as if whoever owned this place didn't mind him being there. And he was so hungry, so cold, so exhausted. Surely whoever lived here, if they were kind enough to leave out food in a storm, wouldn't begrudge him a little sustenance. He sat by the fire and ate, and the food was delicious, better than anything he'd tasted in years. There was meat and bread and vegetables, warm and perfectly prepared, and wine that warmed him from the inside. As he ate, his clothes began to dry, the warmth of the fire soaking into his bones, chasing away the deep chill of the storm. When he'd finished eating, his exhaustion hit him fully. He could barely keep his eyes open. Looking around, he spotted a comfortable-looking chair near the fire, large enough that he could curl up in it. He'd rest for a moment, just until the storm passed, and then he'd find his mysterious host and thank them properly. Just a moment. He fell asleep almost immediately, and you can let yourself sink deeper into rest now too, mirroring the merchant's exhausted sleep, letting the rhythm of the story carry you down into deeper relaxation. When the merchant woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The storm had passed completely, leaving a bright, clear morning. He sat up, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where he was. The fire had burned low, but was still giving off warmth. On the table where he'd eaten the night before, a fresh tray sat with breakfast, hot coffee, fresh bread, fruit, and cheese. Still no sign of anyone, but clearly someone had been there while he slept, tending the fire and leaving food. "Thank you," he called out to the empty room. "Whoever you are, thank you for your kindness." No answer came, but he ate the breakfast gratefully, feeling his strength fully return. Then he thought of his horse and went to check on the animal, only to find that it had also been cared for, groomed, fed, the stall cleaned, fresh water provided. This mysterious host's kindness seemed boundless, if somewhat eerily invisible. The merchant decided he should leave while the weather was good. He had already imposed too much on whoever lived here, even if they didn't seem to mind. He led his horse out of the stable and prepared to mount to continue his journey home. But as he was about to leave, something caught his eye. To one side of the courtyard was a garden, and in that garden, despite it being late in the year, roses were blooming, the most beautiful roses the merchant had ever seen, lush and fragrant, their petals perfect, their colors vivid. And he remembered Belle's request, her one simple wish for a rose. There were so many roses, surely his host wouldn't miss one. It would be a small thing to take, a tiny payment for the generous hospitality he had received, and Belle would be so pleased. He tied his horse and walked into the garden, selected the most beautiful rose he could find, and reached out to pluck it. The moment his fingers touched the stem, a roar split the morning quiet, a sound so loud, so terrible, so full of rage that the merchant's blood turned to ice. He spun around to see a creature emerging from the palace, a figure that made him want to flee in terror. It was a beast. There's no other word for it. It walked on two legs like a man and wore clothes like a man, but its body was huge and powerful, covered in fur, with claws on its hands and feet. Its head was like that of some monstrous animal, features that suggested a lion or bear or some amalgamation of predatory creatures. Its eyes glowed with fury, and when it spoke, its voice was a deep, rumbling snarl that shook the air. "How dare you?" the beast roared. "I give you shelter from the storm. I feed you. I care for your horse. And this is how you repay my hospitality? By stealing from me?" The merchant fell to his knees, the rose dropping from his trembling fingers. "Please forgive me. I meant no harm. I only wanted— my daughter asked for a rose, and I thought— You thought you could take what wasn't yours." The beast stalked closer, and the merchant cowered, certain he was about to die. "You're a thief. The punishment for stealing from me is death." "Please," the merchant was weeping now, hands raised in supplication. "Please, I have daughters. They need me. I'm all they have in the world. Please, if you have any mercy." The beast was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was quieter, though no less intimidating. "Very well. I will spare your life, but on one condition. You will return to your home, settle your affairs, say goodbye to your daughters, and then in 1 month you will return here. Or—" It paused, and something flickered in those animal eyes. Pain, perhaps, or loneliness, or some emotion the merchant couldn't read. "Or," the beast continued, "you may send one of your daughters in my place. If one of them is willing to come here, to live in this palace in exchange for your life, then you need not return yourself." The merchant's heart sunk. "But they wouldn't. I couldn't ask them to." "That is my offer," the beast said flatly. 1 month. Either you return, or one of your daughters comes in your stead. If neither happens, I will come for you, and my vengeance will be terrible. Now go, before I change my mind and kill you now." The merchant needed no further urging. He ran to his horse, mounted with shaking hands, and rode from that place as fast as he could, the beast's ultimatum ringing in his ears. Behind him, the enchanted palace disappeared into the forest as if it had never been, leaving him to wonder if the whole thing had been some terrible nightmare. But the memory of those glowing eyes, that terrible roar, was too vivid to be a dream. As you listen to this part of the story, you might notice how your body has relaxed, even as the tension of the tale built. That's the paradox of bedtime stories. Even the frightening parts don't truly frighten because you are safe in your bed, because you know how the story ends, or at least that it will end well. Let that safety deepen now. Let yourself sink further into rest. The merchant rode home in a daze, the journey passing in a blur. He was torn between relief at still being alive and dread about what awaited him. What would he tell his daughters? How could he possibly explain that his life was forfeit unless one of them sacrificed themselves for him? He couldn't ask that of them. He simply couldn't. When he finally reached the cottage, his daughters rushed out to greet him, their faces bright with expectation. The two older ones immediately asked what he'd brought them, whether he'd gotten everything on their lists. But Belle, looking at his drawn face, his haunted eyes, knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "Father, what happened? Are you hurt?" Inside, he told them everything: the storm, the mysterious palace, the beast, the rose, the terrible bargain. His two elder daughters immediately began wailing about how unfair it was, how terrible, how could this happen to them? But they never, even for a moment, considered going to the beast in their father's place. Belle, however, was quiet as she listened, and when her father finished, she said simply, "I'll go." "No!" The merchant was aghast. "Absolutely not! I won't allow it. I'll think of something else, or I'll return myself, but I won't sacrifice you." "Father, it was my request for the rose that caused this. The fault is mine. And besides," she said with a calm that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, "what choice do we have? You're not well enough to survive whatever the beast might do to you, and we can't live constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for him to come for you." "But you can't," he protested, even as he knew she was right. "Belle, he's a monster. He could hurt you, kill you. I can't let you go to that." Belle placed a hand on his arm. "You said he showed mercy, that he offered this choice. Perhaps he's not as terrible as he appears. Perhaps he's lonely or sad or under some curse. And even if he is terrible, at least you'll be safe. At least my sisters will have you to care for them. This is my choice, Father. Let me make it." The argument went on, but Belle was resolute, and eventually her father, exhausted and ill from his ordeal, had to concede. The two older sisters, though they wouldn't dream of going themselves, were secretly relieved that Belle was willing to go. They told themselves she'd probably be fine, that she was always so good at making the best of things. The month passed too quickly. Belle prepared for her departure with a calmness that broke her father's heart. She packed her few belongings, settled the cottage's affairs, gave her sisters instructions for managing in her absence. She didn't allow herself to think too much about what awaited her, because if she did, her courage might fail. She simply moved forward, one step at a time, doing what needed to be done. On the appointed day, her father insisted on accompanying her, showing her the way to the enchanted palace. They rode together in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Belle looked at the countryside they passed through, memorizing it, wondering if she'd ever see any of it again. The trees were bare now, winter having fully arrived, and the landscape had a stark, melancholy beauty. As they rode deeper into the forest, following the path that the merchant remembered, Belle felt a strange sensation, as if they were crossing some invisible boundary, leaving the ordinary world behind and entering somewhere else, somewhere governed by different rules. The air felt thicker, more charged with possibility. The light filtering through the trees seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. And then there it was, the palace emerging from the forest, just as magnificent and impossible as her father had described. In daylight, Belle could see its full glory, towers and turrets, vast windows, gardens, even in winter, that held an unearthly beauty. It should have been abandoned or crumbling, hidden away in this remote place, but instead it looked pristine, maintained, as if an invisible staff kept everything perfect. They rode through the gates into the courtyard. The palace doors stood open, as if welcoming them, or at least expecting them. Belle dismounted, her legs feeling unsteady. This was it then. This was where her new life, whatever remained of her life, would begin. "I can't let you do this," her father said one last time, tears streaming down his face. "You can't stop me," Belle replied gently. "Go home, father. Take care of my sisters. I'll be all right." She embraced him, memorizing the feeling of his arms around her, the smell of his coat, the sound of his heartbeat. Then she pulled away and walked toward the palace entrance before she could lose her nerve. She heard her father's anguished sob behind her, heard his horse being forced to turn away, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. Belle stepped through the great doors into the palace. They closed behind her with a soft boom that echoed in the silence, and she was alone in the vast entrance hall. The candles were lit as if for her arrival, the fire roaring in the fireplace. But there was no sign of anyone, human or beast. "Hello?" she called, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I'm here as was promised. I've come to fulfill my father's bargain." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, slow, approaching from somewhere deeper in the palace. Her heart began to pound, but she stood her ground, chin lifted, hands clasped to keep them from trembling. The beast appeared in a doorway across the hall, and Belle's first sight of him sent a jolt of pure terror through her body. Her father's description hadn't prepared her for the reality. The massive size, the predatory grace, the wrongness of seeing an animal form dressed in gentleman's clothes. His face was the stuff of nightmares, all fangs and fury, and those eyes, they glowed with an inner light that was both frightening and strangely sad. They stared at each other across the hall. Belle forced herself not to run, not to scream, not to show the full extent of her fear. The beast seemed to be struggling with something else as well. Perhaps disappointment that someone had actually come, perhaps surprise at her apparent composure, or perhaps something else entirely that his monstrous face couldn't properly express. Finally, he spoke, his voice the deep rumble you'd expected. "You came." "Yes, I did," Belle replied, amazed that her voice came out steady. "I gave my word, and my father's life depends on it, so here I am." "You're afraid of me." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Belle admitted. There seemed no point in lying. "You're very frightening." Something flickered in those glowing eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "I am." He was silent for a moment, then continued, "But I won't hurt you. I should tell you that now. You're here of your own choice, and I won't hurt you." Belle didn't know if she believed him, but the words helped nonetheless. "Thank you," she managed. "Come," he said, turning away. "I'll show you to your rooms." And Belle, because she had no other choice, followed the beast deeper into the enchanted palace, into whatever fate awaited her there.
Let your own body sink deeper now. Feel yourself being drawn into the palace along with Belle, into the strange new world she must now inhabit.
The beast led Belle through corridors that seemed to go on forever. past rooms that varied from intimate to vast, all beautifully furnished but eerily empty of people. Finally, they reached a wing of the palace that he explained would be hers, a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything she'd ever inhabited, even in her family's wealthy days. There was a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in silk, soft rugs on polished floors, windows that looked out over gardens that shouldn't have been blooming in winter, but somehow were. There was a sitting room with comfortable chairs and a fireplace, shelves already stocked with books, and when Belle looked closer, she saw they were books she'd longed to read, rare volumes and new releases she'd only heard about. There was even a dressing room with gowns already waiting, beautiful clothes in her size, in colors that suited her. "How did you—" she began, gesturing at the books, the dresses. "The palace provides," the beast said simply. "It knows what's needed, what's desired. You will want for nothing here." "Except freedom," Belle said quietly. The beast's shoulders sagged slightly. "Except that," he agreed. "You may go anywhere in the palace and grounds. The only place that's forbidden is the West Wing. Those are my private chambers. Otherwise, everything is yours to explore. But you cannot leave, not ever." That was the bargain. Belle felt the weight of those words settle on her. Never leave. Never see her father or sisters again. Never go beyond these walls. It was, in essence, a beautiful prison. But she'd known that coming here, had accepted it as the price of her father's life. "I understand," she said, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Dinner will be served at 8, the beast said, his tone formal, as if he were a host instructing a guest rather than a jailer informing a prisoner. He left before she could respond, his heavy footsteps receding down the corridor. Belle stood alone in her luxurious rooms, feeling the full reality of her situation crash over her. She sat on the edge of the beautiful bed and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not the loud wailing sobs of her sisters, but quiet tears of grief and fear and profound loneliness. But she didn't cry for long. Belle had never been one to wallow in self-pity, and she wouldn't start now. She dried her eyes, washed her face, and decided to explore her surroundings. If she was to live here, she might as well understand her prison. The suite was indeed magnificent. The books were a treasure. She could spend years reading them all. The windows showed gardens that were impossible but beautiful, roses blooming alongside spring flowers and autumn leaves, all seasons existing together. The dresses, when she examined them, were exquisite and fit her perfectly, though she had no idea how that was possible. As 8 o'clock approached, Belle made a decision. She could hide in her rooms, avoiding the beast, but that would only delay the inevitable. They would have to coexist somehow, and putting off their next encounter wouldn't make it any easier. So she dressed in one of the simple but elegant gowns provided and made her way down to the dining hall, following a path that she somehow knew, as if the palace itself was guiding her steps. The dining hall was lit by hundreds of candles, and a table was set for 2, one end for her, one end for the beast, with the length of the table between them. The beast was already there,
standing when she entered, his massive form incongruous with the formal manners he was clearly trying to display. "You came," he said, and she heard surprise in his voice. "You invited me," Belle replied, taking her seat. Dinner appeared, or perhaps it had been there all along, but she hadn't noticed. Invisible servants, she realized, or some magic that anticipated needs. The food was delicious, and despite her circumstances, Belle found she was hungry. They ate in awkward silence for a while, the beast clearly trying to eat delicately despite his fangs and claws, Belle trying not to stare at him. Finally, the beast spoke. "Tell me about yourself." It was such an ordinary request, so at odds with the extraordinary situation that Belle almost laughed, but she didn't. Instead, she began to talk about her father, her sisters, their former life and their reduced circumstances, her love of reading, the cottage in the countryside. The beast listened attentively, asking occasional questions, and gradually Belle found herself relaxing slightly. His voice, though deep and rough, wasn't unkind. His questions showed genuine interest and intelligence. When she asked him about himself, though, he shut down. "There's nothing to tell," he said shortly. "I am what you see, a beast living in a cursed palace." "But how—" she began. "That's not a subject I care to discuss," he interrupted, his voice hardening. "Ask me anything else, but not about that." So Belle didn't press, and they finished their meal in a slightly strained silence. As she was about to leave, the beast spoke again. "Will you dine with me tomorrow night as well?" Belle hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I will." Something in the beast's posture eased, as if he had been braced for rejection. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Good night, Belle." "Good night," she replied, and returned to her rooms, her mind whirling with the strangeness of it all. Thus began a routine that would structure Belle's days in the enchanted palace. She would wake late, having slept poorly at first, but gradually adjusting. She would spend her days exploring the vast palace, the library that seemed to contain every book ever written, the music room with instruments that played themselves softly when she entered, the conservatory with flowers and exotic plants from around the world, the galleries hung with paintings and tapestries that told stories she tried to piece together. The gardens were her favorite, though. They were impossibly beautiful and entirely private, a world unto themselves. She would walk the paths for hours, thinking, reading on benches tucked into alcoves, watching fountains and birds and the play of light through leaves. In the gardens, she could almost forget her captivity, could almost feel free. And every evening she would dine with the beast. At first their conversations were stilted and awkward, full of long silences and safe topics. But gradually, slowly, they began to talk more easily. The beast, she discovered, was well-read and thoughtful. He knew music and art and could discuss philosophy and poetry. He had opinions on the books Belle was reading and recommended others she might enjoy. He was also, beneath his frightening exterior, deeply lonely. Belle began to sense the isolation he must have endured, trapped in this palace with only invisible servants for company. She didn't know how long he had been here, he wouldn't say, but she could feel the weight of that solitude,
in how he talked, how eagerly he awaited their evening meals, and how carefully he listened to every word she said. For her part, Belle found herself slowly, very slowly, becoming less afraid of him. His appearance still startled her sometimes when she caught sight of him unexpectedly, but she was learning to see past the monstrous exterior to the person beneath. He was gentle with her, careful never to make sudden movements that might frighten her, always respectful of her space and her wishes. Still, she was a prisoner, and she couldn't forget that. The palace was beautiful, the food was exquisite, the books were wonderful, but none of it changed the fact that she couldn't leave, couldn't see her father, couldn't have any life beyond these walls. Sometimes, especially at night, the weight of that would press down on her, and she would cry into her pillow, muffling the sound so no one, human, beast, or invisible servant, could hear.
Let yourself feel Belle's adjustment, the way she was adapting to circumstances she couldn't change, finding small comforts and moments of peace within her captivity. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, not literal imprisonment, but situations where you had to make the best of things that weren't ideal, where you had to find beauty and meaning in circumstances you wouldn't have chosen. Your body is resting deeply now, sinking further into the bed, as Belle was slowly, carefully settling into her new life.
As weeks turned into months, time moved strangely in the enchanted palace, both too fast and too slow. A pattern emerged in Belle and the Beast's evening dinners. They would talk, their conversations ranging from superficial pleasantries to deep discussions of philosophy, literature, morality. The Beast was, Belle had to admit, one of the most interesting conversationalists she'd ever encountered. His mind was sharp, his thoughts complex, his insights often surprising. But every evening, as dinner wound down, the Beast would ask Belle a question, always the same question, delivered with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if he knew what the answer would be, but couldn't help asking anyway. "Belle," he would say, his voice dropping even lower than usual, "will you marry me?" And Belle, every time, would feel her heart clench, not from desire, but from guilt and confusion. "No, Beast," she would answer, as gently as she could. "I cannot." "Do you find me too ugly?" he would ask, though he clearly already knew the answer. "I find you frightening to look at," Belle admitted one night. "I'm sorry, but I can't lie to you. Your appearance is difficult for me. But it's not just that. Marriage requires love, and I don't love you. I care for you as a friend, truly. I've come to value our time together. But that's not the same as the kind of love marriage needs. Would you ever, could you ever?" The Beast couldn't seem to finish the question. "I don't know," Belle said honestly. "I can't see the future, but I can't promise something I don't feel." The Beast would nod, as if he had expected this answer, and wish her good night. And Belle would return to her rooms, feeling guilty and confused. Why did he keep asking? Surely he knew she would refuse. And yet every night he asked again, his hope seemingly undiminished by repeated rejection. As more time passed, was it months now? Half a year? Belle found herself thinking about the beast even when they weren't together. She would see something in a book and think, the beast would find this interesting. Or she would encounter a beautiful sunset in the garden and wish he were there to see it with her, though he rarely came outside during daylight hours. She had long since been frightened of him. His appearance still startled her sometimes. She doubted she'd ever completely adjust to his monstrous features, but she no longer feared him. She knew he would never hurt her, that beneath the frightening exterior was someone kind and thoughtful, someone who treated her more respect than most humans had. More troubling were the moments when she found herself noticing things beyond his appearance. The way his eyes, despite their inhuman glow, could express such depth of emotion. The care he took in selecting books he thought she'd enjoy, leaving them in her sitting room as surprises. The gentleness of his voice when he spoke her name. These observations confused her because they suggested feelings she wasn't ready to examine. One evening, after another proposal and another gentle refusal, Belle made a request. Beast, would you tell me how you came to be here? What curse transformed you? The beast was silent for so long that Belle thought he wouldn't answer, that he would shut down as he had done before. But finally he spoke, his voice heavy with old pain. I was not always as you see me now. Once I was human, a prince, though I was unworthy of the title. I was vain, selfish, cruel. I cared only for beauty and wealth, for the surface of things rather than their substance. I judged everyone by their appearance and found most people wanting. I had no compassion, no kindness, no love for anyone but myself. He paused, and Belle waited, hardly breathing, afraid he would stop. But one winter night, an old woman came to my castle, seeking shelter from a storm. She was ugly and poor, dressed in rags, and she offered me a single rose in exchange for shelter. I laughed at her. I mocked her appearance and sent her away into the storm, telling her I wanted nothing from someone so revolting to look at. Belle could picture it, a younger, human version of the beast, beautiful on the outside, but monstrous inside, the opposite of what he was now. But she was no old woman. She was an enchantress, and she had been testing me, testing whether I had any kindness in my heart. When I failed that test, she revealed her true form, beautiful and terrible, and pronounced my curse. She transformed me into this form, a beast whose outside matched the ugliness of my soul. She cursed my entire household. My servants became invisible, trapped as ghosts in this palace. And she gave me one chance at redemption. The rose, Belle whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. The rose, the beast confirmed. She gave me an enchanted rose and told me it would bloom until my 21st year. Before the last petal fell, I had to learn to love another and earn that person's love in return. If I did, the curse would be broken. If I failed, I would remain a beast forever, and my servants would remain trapped as well.
"How long do you have?" Belle asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The rose has been blooming for years now. I don't know exactly how much time remains. Months, perhaps? Maybe less." His voice was flat, as if he'd long since given up hope. "But it doesn't matter. Look at me. Who could ever love this?" Belle felt a strange pain in her chest. "You're not the person you were then. You've changed. The curse may have changed your outside, but it seems it's changed your inside too, for the better." "Not enough," the beast said quietly. "Not in time." That night, Belle lay in bed unable to sleep, thinking about what she'd learned. The beast had been punished for judging by appearances, and now he was trapped in an appearance that prevented anyone from seeing his inner self. It was a cruel irony, and yet also just. He had learned compassion and kindness, but would it be enough? Could he ever truly fulfill the curse's conditions? And more troubling, could she help him? Should she? When he asked her to marry him, was he asking because the curse required it, or because he genuinely cared for her? And did it matter? Belle didn't have answers to these questions, but they occupied her thoughts more and more. She found herself watching the beast during their dinners, studying his expressions, listening not just to his words, but to the emotion behind them. And she had to admit, at least to herself, that her feelings had deepened into something more complex than friendship. She cared what happened to him. She wanted him to be happy. She looked forward to their evenings together. The palace, which had felt like a prison, had begun to feel like a home, and much of that was because of him. But did she love him? Could she love him? Love was supposed to involve attraction, and his appearance was still difficult for her. Love was supposed to be a choice freely made, and she was his captive, unable to leave. How could she know if what she felt was genuine or just a product of circumstance, of being isolated with only him for company? These questions troubled her sleep, made her thoughtful and distracted during the day, and the beast noticed her changed mood, though he misinterpreted its cause. "You're unhappy," he said one evening. "I'm confused," Belle admitted. "You miss your family." It's true she did miss them, especially her father, but that wasn't what was troubling her most. Still she nodded, because it was an easier truth than the complicated feeling she couldn't articulate. "Would you like to see them?" the beast asked quietly. Belle's head snapped up. "What?" "I have a magic mirror. It can show you anyone you wish to see. Would that help?" Belle felt tears spring to her eyes. This small kindness, this consideration of her needs touched her deeply. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that very much." Let your breathing slow now, deep and easy, as we approach.
For the first few days back home, Belle felt as though she were living in a dream. The little cottage was just as she remembered, though smaller now, more fragile somehow, as if it too had aged in her absence. Her father's health began to improve almost immediately, the color returning to his face simply from the joy of having her near again. He would sit by the fire, watching her move about the room as if afraid that if he blinked, she might vanish once more. Her sisters, on the other hand, were not so pleased. They were astonished at the fine clothes Belle wore, at her calmness, her grace. How strange, one whispered to the other, that she lived with a monster and yet looks happier than we ever did. They peppered her with questions about the beast's palace, the gowns, the jewels, the food, the luxury. But Belle spoke little of it. When she mentioned the beast himself, it was with quiet affection that puzzled them. "He was kind to me," she said once. "Lonely, but kind." They laughed behind her back, convinced she was hiding some secret treasure. Days passed in peaceful rhythm. Belle read to her father, tended the little garden, and slept deeply for the first time in months. But each morning she woke with an ache she couldn't name, a strange emptiness, as though she had left a part of herself behind. She tried to dismiss it as habit, the echo of her old routine, but the feeling grew stronger. The beast's face would appear in her thoughts when she least expected it, his deep voice, his careful courtesy, the sadness in his eyes. On the 6th night, unable to sleep, she lit a candle and took out the magic mirror. "Show me the beast," she whispered. The surface shimmered, and the image that formed made her gasp. The great hall was dark, the candles long extinguished. The gardens were overgrown, their colors faded. And in the center of it all lay the beast collapsed on the marble floor beside the rose's pedestal. He was motionless, his breathing shallow, his great body thinner, frailer. Beside him lay the glass dome, shattered, and the rose itself nearly bare, only one petal clinging stubbornly to its stem. Her heart clenched. She understood at once. He had believed she would not return, and grief had undone him. "He's dying," she whispered, "dying because of me." Her father woke to find her already packing. "I must go," she told him, kissing his hands. "I gave my word, and he kept faith with me. I cannot let him die alone." He tried to protest, but she was already on her way, the mirror clutched to her chest. She thought of the palace, and once again the world shimmered and shifted around her. When she opened her eyes, she was standing before the gates. The gardens were wild now, the air heavy with neglect. As she entered the great hall, her footsteps echoed in the emptiness. "Beast!" she called, her voice breaking. "It's me, Belle! I've come back!" Only silence answered. Then faintly, a sound, a ragged breath, a low groan. She followed it to the rose room. There he lay, exactly as she had seen. Eyes closed, his fur dull, his chest barely rising. Belle knelt beside him, tears falling freely. "You fool," she whispered, touching his paw. "Did you think I would not return? Did you think I could forget you?" His eyes fluttered open. "You came back," he breathed, barely audible. "I thought you'd found your happiness elsewhere." "I did not know happiness until I met you," Belle said through her tears. "But I was blind. I didn't see it until now." He tried to smile, but his strength was gone. "At least, I saw you once last time." His eyes closed again, and the last petal of the rose trembled, then fell. "No!" Belle cried, gathering him in her arms. "Don't leave me! Please, please live! I love you!" She hadn't meant to say it. The words simply burst from her, raw and true. "I love you," she whispered again, pressing her forehead against his. "Not for what you are, but for who you are." For a moment there was only stillness, the deep, heavy stillness of endings.
Then a soft wind stirred the air, and the broken petals of the rose began to lift, swirling around them in a slow, glowing dance. The light grew brighter, pulsing with warmth. Belle felt the beast's body shift in her arms, the coarse fur softening, the claws retreating, the shape beneath her changing. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer holding a monster. A young man lay where the beast had been, pale, weak, but unmistakably human. His eyes opened, and they were the same eyes she had known all along. "Belle," he whispered, his voice still carrying that deep, familiar tone. "It's me." She could only stare, wonder and disbelief flooding through her. "You're alive," she murmured. "You're free," he said softly. "You broke the curse." The palace itself seemed to awaken with him. Light flared in the chandeliers, the gardens outside burst into sudden bloom, and laughter echoed faintly, the voices of servants restored to life, unseen no longer. The air was filled with music, the sound of joy long held in silence. But Belle and the prince heard none of it, lost in their gaze, recognizing in each other something far deeper than gratitude or enchantment, the quiet certainty of love earned, not given. When the prince rose, fully restored, he took Belle's hand. "You saved me," he said simply. "You saved me first. You taught me to see." They walked together through the halls, now vibrant with color and life. The mirrors shone, the fountain sang again, and every door opened as they passed, as if the palace itself rejoiced in their steps. That night the stars burned brighter than they ever had before, and the moon hung low over the castle, silvering the roses in their eternal bloom. Belle wrote to her father, sending carriages to bring him to the palace. When he arrived, he could hardly recognize his daughter, radiant and serene beside the prince, who treated him with the tenderness of a son. The sisters came too, curious, envious, and a little ashamed. The magic of the place softened even their hearts. The elder two, who had once mocked Belle's simplicity, began to understand that beauty without kindness is only a shadow. In time, Belle and the prince were married, though their wedding was not grand in the usual way. There were no crowds, no display of wealth, only the sound of birds in the gardens, the scent of roses, and the presence of those who truly mattered. The palace, now restored, became a place not of isolation, but of welcome, a haven for travelers lost in storms, for the weary and the kind-hearted. And as the years passed, stories spread of a castle where love had broken a terrible curse, where beauty was not measured by the eye, but by the heart. But somewhere deep within each of us lives both the beauty and the beast, the part that fears and the part that forgives, the part that hides and the part that hopes. And when love teaches those parts to see each other clearly, that's when transformation truly begins. So, if you are listening to this as you drift toward sleep, let that be the message you carry into your dreams, that every kindness is a kind of magic, every act of understanding a spell that reshapes the world. And now the story fades, as all stories must. The night grows still, the castle sleeps beneath its roses, and you too can rest, knowing that, like Belle, you are safe, and that morning always follows even the longest enchantment.